So, yeah, I'm Sophie Bray from the Mersey Forest. I'm a Woodland Advisor, and I'm currently working on the Trees for Climate programme. So you might have heard of the Mersey Forest before. It was established in the early 90s to deliver tree planting and a network of woodlands and green spaces across Merseyside and North Cheshire. We're a small but growing team with a wide variety of expertise, including land use, climate change, natural flood management, community engagement, and woodland management. The Mersey Forest has grown over the years, and now we cover 9 local authority areas. We work in partnership with local authorities as well, and charitable organisations, as well as the private sector. These are just some examples of the 9 million trees that the Mersey Forest have planted over the last 30 years, not including when we started our current project. This is a site that's called Collier's Moss. It's in St Helens, and also you can just see Griffin Wood, which is along the M62 in the distance. Of course, people are at the heart of everything that the Mersey Forest does. We work with people all over the area. All of our programmes are aimed at benefiting communities and local people. Trees that are proven to have many beneficial effects, including improving health, well-being and air quality. So a little bit of background about the community forests. It can be quite unclear as to exactly what a community forest is. And Jess, who's the director over at City of Trees, describes it as a movement rather than a place. So England's community forests are located around our largest towns and cities. Collectively, the work of the forest has formed the largest environmental regeneration initiative in England. For around 30 years, we've been delivering urban, economic and social regeneration and championing, I can't say my word, sorry, green infrastructure and creating high quality environments for millions of people. By planting trees and bringing woodlands back into use for people and wildlife, we've been able to continue to provide new opportunities for things like leisure, recreation, cultural activities, enhancing biodiversity and helping us as a country become more resilient to climate change. We like to accompany all of that with education programmes and trying to encourage people to get out in the outdoors and improve their health. So, where do trees fit into the path to net zero and nature recovery? So all local authorities in the Mersey Forest have declared a climate emergency, and they've done this by January 2020. Outlined in the government's England Trees Action Plan is a long-term vision for trees, woodlands and forests across the country. A target has been set of 30,000 hectares to be delivered by the end of the current Parliament, which is quite hefty if you know about the history of tree planting in our country. Nothing's ever been attempted at this scale recently. Trees can be delivered on both carbon sequestration and also biodiversity improvements, as well as providing economic, environmental and social benefits. Sir William Worsley stated in his foreword to the England Tree Action Plan that climate change and biodiversity loss now require our generation to respond more boldly, taking us far beyond where we are today, planting vastly more trees in England and protecting and improving our existing woodlands. It will be key to the government's plan to achieve net zero and create a nature recovery network across the length of England. So trees and woodlands are carbon negative. It takes them a little while to get there, and we can discuss that later on. But they are an incredible natural tool to sequester carbon and store it long term. So Trees for Climate is a programme that I work on currently. and it's how the government is proposing to deliver the unprecedented amounts of tree planting. So there is a £640 million Nature for Climate Fund, which has been launched already. It's split between two programmes, both aimed at sequestering carbon. One is England's Peat Action Plan, and the other, which is the larger part of this project, is the Trees for Climate programme. So what is Trees for Climate? It's a grant fund delivered through all of England's 13 community forests. And the idea is that we are able to cover the cost of woodland creation for private and public landowners. The programme began in 2020 and it's available for 5 years ending in April 2025. So we've just completed our second year of delivery. We're working at the moment towards new schemes that will be planted this coming winter. So tree seasons almost line up with financial years, which can be a bit tricky to try and explain to our accountants and to DEFRA at the end of the year, but we plant trees through the winter, so that is our season of planting. Woodland advisors like me at the Mersey Forest will provide support on all elements of woodland design and creation. So that's everything from an initial site visit to look at landscape and soils, all the way through to maintaining the young trees to establishment. Landowners enter into an agreement with us that lasts for 15 years, in which they must maintain those trees. After that period, the trees would fall under the Forestry Act, and that would be regulated by Forestry Commission. So you can see highlighted here, we always aim to cover the full cost of woodland creation wherever we can. We basically act as a free woodland agent for landowners who wouldn't be able to do this kind of project normally. There's no minimum amount of space that we will fund. We will do anything from 0.1 hectares to 100,000 hectares. We also provide funding for infrastructure, things like fencing or gates that might be necessary for the woodland to establish successfully. And then we provide ongoing maintenance support, money, and also our expertise. So we don't just leave people hanging once the trees are in the ground. So you can see here examples of woodland that we support. So it really does cover a lot of things. So we do everything from natural colonisation, which is where we would, the new word is rewilding, but essentially what we would do is ensure that there's a seed source nearby that is suitable for establishing the woodland in the area. We'd then assess how many browsing mammals, what invasive species are around, and then we would probably fence that area and monitor it. We'd like to see that there is some trees coming through the ground quite quickly, and then if the natural colonisation fails, then we would expect the landowner to go in and stock that area with trees within 10 years if there hasn't been any sign of natural regeneration. We fund hedgerows, both with and without trees. I think a lot of people know how beneficial for wildlife and connectivity hedgerows are. We tend to do all biodiverse hedgerows, so hedgerows that have 6 or more woody species in them, and we try and fit them into the landscape as well. We do low density tree planting, so that is your typical parkland or wood pasture style planting. That is a really rare habitat, wood pasture, and it's something that we're really keen to improve on. Obviously, you're not going to be storing as much carbon with that kind of habitat, but there is space for everything in the scheme. And then we cover your more traditional types of planting, ranging from very small schemes, which might be in communities on small green spaces. Sometimes people have large back gardens and they want to do their bit for the environment, and they invite us over and we put in small woodlands on their property, all the way up to big multi-purpose woodlands that might be registered for carbon credits. So how should we create woodlands and forests? I think it's really important for us to be creating sustainable woodlands going forward. We know now what we know now, and what we can do as an industry is ensure that everything we do is best practice from now on. The UK Forestry Standards sets out regulations and good practice guidelines for forestry practitioners, and it covers all woodlands in the UK. It ensures that we're all working in a sustainable way together. So it outlines some clear principles, which you can see there: biodiversity, climate change, historic environment, landscape, people, soil and water. And these are the principles that we apply to all woodland creation projects. Things like ensuring that there's diversity of species. So even within a commercial forestry, which is not necessarily what I'm doing at the moment, it still would ensure that no one species makes up more than 75% of total species, and there must be an element of native species in there with shrub species and a certain amount of open space to promote other habitats. And 15% of any forest should be managed with biodiversity and conservation as a major objective. So climate change is obviously something that's high on the agenda for everybody, and it is the main aim of Trees for Climate. So forests play an important role in the global carbon cycle. They account for almost 3/4 of the annual exchange of carbon between the land and the atmosphere. Land use change has contributed approximately to 1/4 of the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution. And forestry, which includes deforestation, accounts for about 17.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So forests obviously capture carbon and store it in their wood of the tree itself, and also within soil over time as forests shed their leaves, branches, and there is root death. This builds up the organic matter in the soil and locks in carbon. The rate of carbon captured is closely linked to the growth rate of the tree. So the larger the tree, the more potential for it to store carbon. As we all know, carbon dioxide has a direct impact on the impacts of climate change, and it also impacts the function and productivity of trees. With an increase in the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it's likely to cause an increase in the growth rates of trees and this area of leaves. There's also likely to be a number of new effects on woodland through changes to the frequency and severity of pest and disease outbreaks and the population of mammals that might threaten those trees, and also the impacts of invasive species that might come and overwhelm newly planted trees and decrease biodiversity in existing woodlands. We're still not sure about how trees are going to respond to the changes in the climate or how woodland ecosystems as a whole will be affected. But irrespective of the future success in reducing emissions, the global climate is already locked into a certain level of climate change that we're going to have to adapt to. So when we're planning for uncertainty, we are looking at what species we should be planting for long-term sustainable forest management. Those things are species selection. So we want to be looking at where has a climate that will be like our climate in 50 years. So we're able to use a tool that's provided by Forest Research where we can search the location of the woodland that we're going to be creating and compare it with a climate scenario in 50 or 80 years time. So you're generally looking at places like, for comparison, of northern France or southern England for up here in the north. We also want to be aware of what pests and diseases are coming. We're all unfortunately seeing the impacts of ash dieback at the moment. So everybody has stopped planting ash. Also, you have to have a mix of drought tolerant and water tolerant trees. Some places are going to get much drier, some places are going to get much wetter. So we have to bear that in mind when we're looking at new woodlands. So, where should we plant? The Mersey Forest plan has already done the work of identifying opportunity areas for woodland creation. This includes areas that currently have low amounts of tree cover and would benefit the most from some types of tree planting. This might be urban trees, it might be riparian corridors, it might be extensions to existing woodlands or connecting to woodlands that have never been connected before. You can get in touch with us through our website and email or by giving us a call. We have an online map here where you can drop a pin as to where you think you would like to see more trees in your area or in areas that you know quite well and that need trees. There's an interactive map on our website, so if you have any ideas after this talk, please head over there or feel free to drop me an email. So when designing a new woodland, what is involved? So what is involved when we're having a look at to see if a site is suitable for tree planting and what tree is going to be best for that site. Before I even get to site, I would be using some of the online platforms such as Forestry Commission's Land Information Search and DEFRA's Magic Maps, which some of you might have used before. It's free to use, so you can go online and have a play about if you particularly like maps. I'm looking to see if there are any major constraints that I should be aware of before I make a site visit. So that could be looking for any kind of peaty soils, particularly deep peat. So that would, if there was deep peat on site, that would mean that I wouldn't be planting trees on that site. There's a policy, it's just come out from Forestry Commission, where we do not plant trees on deep peat or within 200 metres of deep peat, because we don't want to disrupt the hydrology of the peat soils and dry them out with tree planting. Also, something I'm looking forward to see if there's any priority habitats I should be looking out for on site or priority species that might be present. It's also helpful to know what the prior land use was. So often sites may be agricultural. Was it previously a landfill site? Could be an amenity grassland, or is it something else? Sometimes we have been called out to sites that look like they're amenity grassland and there is only about 3 inches of topsoil on top of what was a car park. So it's always really important to take your spade with you and check for soil depth. So you can see here, there's a short list. My list is probably 4 or 5 times this long of everything that I check in the end before planting takes place. So we're going to have a little look at some of the mapping services that I use. So we use a lot of maps and a lot of data in making our decisions. So we accompany these desk-based surveys with on-site surveys, and then we will also go out to partner organisations. So it could be record, we might get a list of ecological records for a site. We also would consult with the local historic environment officer. We might consult with Historic England, Natural England, the Environment Agency, National Grid. There's a lot of partners involved in any kind of woodland creation project. So this is the Land Information Search browser. We could just call it LIS for short. So on here, there are many, many layers. One of the most important ones that's highlighted here is low risk areas for woodland creation. So the thing to know about these maps is that they have all been done from desk-based studies. So the land has not been surveyed on the ground. This has been mapped purely from a desk. So you have to go and ground truth all of these things. So the yellow areas you can see highlighted on the map have been zoned as very low risk areas for woodland creation. That means when Forestry Commissioner having a look at the project, which they look at every project over 0.5 hectares, or if it's sensitive on a sensitive site and it's small, they'll look at that as well. If it's already highlighted yellow, that's a green flag for them to say that this has probably not got any major constraints, things like peat soils. We also want to have a look at identifying what the soil type is and what the land use is. So something I'm going to look at is the agricultural grade that the land is. We want to utilise less productive land for tree planting and habitat creation and leave the high grade areas to be used for producing food. So this map was actually produced as part of the Northern Forest mapping exercise, which is another programme that has been running for a little bit longer than Trees for Climate and is still running now. So here's a close-up of the Mersey Forest. So you can see grade 1 is prime, top, very high quality agricultural soils, all the way down to grade 5, which would be considered very, very poor soils that wouldn't be used for farming. Normally within farming, grade 3 is kind of the poorest that anybody would try and bother farming with, in my experience, their very limited experience. So suitable tree planting can help things like slow the flow of rainwater reaching rivers and preventing or alleviating at least flooding events. So we can use maps like this to see if we are working in areas that would benefit from additional canopy cover, or we could use it to target certain areas where we know that flooding or they are at risk of flooding. And here's some of the natural flood management that we've done in the Mersey Forest. So we have a natural flood management officer who covers the entire area, and we work in partnership with people like the Mersey Rivers Trust and local authorities on a lot of different projects to help alleviate flooding. So new woodlands and hedgerows can be a really important wildlife corridor that connects habitats, but it's also very important that we aren't accidentally negatively impacting on protected sites. So looking for protected sites and priority habitats is something that we would always do before carrying out a woodland creation project. So you can see here some of the local NNRs, SSSIs. There's obviously a lot to do with the Sefton Coast here, but we also have lots of other important sites and historic woodlands. And this is a habitat network mapping project that was done to see where the opportunities are to extend existing habitats. So we would look out for pieces of land like this. We do acquisitions as well. So if something came up that was within this opportunity mapping zone, we would be really interested in that piece of land because of the additionality of the benefits. And here's just an example of where woodland itself, a priority habitat, can benefit something like a wetland at Delamere Forest. So another thing that I would be looking for is point data for specific ecological records. So this is Great Crested Newt records, particularly from licence returns, so from ecologist surveys, would all be put on this map, and it's really helpful to see where that is, particularly when creating woodlands. Great Crested Newt would use woodland, but the Forestry Commission officers are interested to know that we're going to make sure that we mitigate and limit any negative impact there might be on hibernating newts. And something that we also use is historic data. So we would have a look here. This is just one that's got registered battlefields, scheduled monuments, earthworks. We came across a suspected Roman road in a project last year that we didn't know was there. Yeah, so things like this do pop up, and obviously we want to exclude tree planting from any areas that might be historically or archaeologically sensitive. So this is an example. If something may just look like a large open ditch, but it's actually a medieval mill race that is near Picton in Cheshire. There was also medieval field boundaries and medieval ridge and furrow on this site, which is quite unusual for this part of the world, but yeah, we were still able to do some successful tree planting, meadow creation, and not disturb the archaeological features. So soils also help us decide on which trees we're going to plant. We want to ensure that the species we've selected are going to thrive and be well suited to the site. So I would use maps that help me see what kind of soils I'm working with, as well as actually digging soil pits across the site and looking at the soils myself. Not that I am a soils expert, far from it. And this is just a tool that we often use to help us make our species selection. So it's the National Vegetation Classification for woodland types. Some of them are listed here. A typical one for the area is the W10 NVC classification, which is lowland mixed broadleaf woodland. So if you can have a look on the table there, you can see some of the major and minor species that are involved in that. And there's also one that recommends shrub species as well. So I would be looking at this in conjunction with the ecological site classification tool, which is the one that helps me predict climate scenarios in the future, and combining them along with my knowledge of on the ground site surveys, soils and water levels to create a woodland that I think is going to be sustainable and healthy in the future. That can be a bit tricky, and even with these classifications, every woodland is completely different. As you'll see on this next slide, this is just a small selection of our photographs of our woodlands that we've either helped manage or we've planted. Every woodland is completely different and unique, and that's what makes them so special, but it also makes them so hard to categorise and then reproduce. So you can see up there, there was the pine woods at Formby. Let me go back. Previous. Pine woods at Formby, which we help manage some older woodland, what looks like a very mature, possibly semi-ancient natural woodland with this edge of silver birch, and a birch willow woodland with a lot of primrose. So I thought it would be helpful if I showed you a case study from last year of one of the sites that we planted, and just took you through some of the actual practical steps of getting a woodland in. So this is a site that is in North Cheshire. So landowners often approach us. We don't currently do much advertising of our scheme. We work a lot with partner organisations for schemes, and we are approached by the public. So either parish councillors, local authorities, or private landowners, and sometimes charities as well. So the first discussion, and that often happens on the phone, but will happen many times throughout the project, is what are the landowner objectives? So in this case, for me, it was a dream come true. The landowner's main objective was to improve the habitat and increase wildlife. They'd purchased a small ex-dairy farm that had organic status. They wanted to extend an existing woodland. They wanted to connect the habitats in the local area, increase the suitability for wildlife, create a beautiful place for them and their family to enjoy. And they also really wanted it to be plastic free, pesticide and herbicide free, and also not have any fencing. So luckily we were in Cheshire West as opposed to Cheshire East, where there is a lot more deer pressure, and fencing really would have been required had we been a bit further east. But hopefully there will be no deer in this area. So the first thing I'm looking at, like I mentioned earlier, is doing a desk study before I even get to the site. It can tell me a lot of information that I can then investigate when I'm there. So you can see that there is a overhead electricity cables. There's also a pylon tower actually on site. We have records of great crested newt in this pond and in this pond. So one is on site, one is just off site, but it's still important to me. This is still a very walkable distance for great crested newt. And it made me think instantly, is there opportunity to create more ponds on site? And there's also a public right of way. So this is the sandstone trail here, actually hugs this hedgerow here, which is great because it means that the family are going to benefit from this woodland, but also there's going to be a lot of members of the public who can visit as well. So whilst they might not be able to go actually into the woodland unless the landowners kind of make it open access, they will be able to see it. And there's also adjacent a priority habitat here. So there's a really well established semi-natural ancient woodland, which is mainly kind of an upland Cecil oak, silver birch mix, but it's really beautiful, but it's very steep, which is why it's never been felled and converted into agricultural land. And it's also worth mentioning, just off screen here, there is actually quite a large woodland that the Mersey Forest created. I think it was one of the first ones they did in this area. So it's quite well established now, about 30 years old, 20 to 30 years old. So putting some more connectivity in between these two woodlands would be really beneficial. So here is something that I use quite regularly in conjunction with the records that Record provide me with, and the NBN Atlas. So I can hop on here really quickly, do a search and have a look and see what records pop up. So you can see here we've got one record back of great crested newt, but I knew from some information that the landowners had provided me with that there was more records available. So that is for the pond that's at the farmhouse. And after I've done all of my data searches, so I've consulted the Historic Environment Officer, I've gotten a report back from Record Centre, I've gone and dug soil pits, I've had a chat with the Forestry Commission Officer, because this is going to have to be regulated. This scheme is totaling 7.2 hectares, so way above the 0.5 threshold. So that means it's going to have to go through an ecological assessment, and that will be overviewed by the Forestry Commission. So when I've made sure that there are no constraints on site and that I'm okay to go ahead with woodland, I'm going to start doing some iterations of design. So I'm trying to incorporate a minimum of 20% open spaces within this woodland planting. So that can include tracks and rides, but also small areas that are left unplanted. So a really easy place that I would leave unplanted anyway is underneath the power lines. And then by some water. And so I just went through this as a very first iteration of a plan. I'd then show this to the landowner and they'd say, yes, no, maybe, let's have a little look at it again. And then this was the plan that we ended up with. So you can see that there's different types of habitat that are going to be here, and I'll just point them out because I've not put the labels on this map, which is a bit annoying. So the dots here are the shrubby edges. So we always try and create this woodland edge effect. This is the most biodiverse part of the woodland, and that can be managed to keep it quite shrubby and short and mixed. So, and we've also kept some places where there's more shrub. So you can see all these places are just complete shrub planting. So that's going to be with species like hawthorn, hazel, dogwood, guelder rose, anything that's nice and shrubby, provides nectar, provides berries, is going to provide those little niche habitats that invertebrates really love. We're going to put in those areas. We've also got the broadleaf woodland areas, which are these plain green areas, and the darker green areas are small patches of Scots pine. There's quite a lot of Scots pine in the local area, so it reflects the local character of the area by having Scots pine on these high points. And we also had anywhere else that's of these open, it's not anywhere else, sorry. These open spaces around here and over here are areas for natural regeneration. There's there's already quite a bit of older regeneration coming through over by those trees, and already quite a lot of willow and birch and poplar coming through here. There's a ditch that runs through here that's wet, which is why you can see there's wet species there. So this is one of the planting plans that we ended up with. So on-site preparation, you can see these are the overhead power lines. Hopefully this grassland strip will be a really good raptor hunting ground in the years to come. I suggested to the landowners, they have a really healthy population of raptors already, but they could improve that by putting in some perch posts, which I think they'd be quite keen on doing, and that would also help to ensure that there weren't too many voles on site. And voles really love to make nests at the base of young trees, and then they end up ring barking the tree and it unfortunately dies. So we have to make sure all of our permissions are in place. We've got approval from the Forestry Commission to go ahead with the planting. We had to cut and remove all the vegetation. So the field had been standing for 3 years before we planted. So that's great for the soils, but there was a really high rank vegetation. And even though there is a lot of value to that vegetation, unfortunately, it does need to be removed for the tree to be planted, but it will grow back. So we have to look and see if we needed to reduce any compaction. So particularly in arable fields or fields that have been used for arable, or they've suffered a lot of poaching from livestock walking over, you might need to alleviate that compaction by ripping the ground with a subsoiler, which slices through the soil, helps aerate it, and will stop things like flooding or preventing roots from penetrating what's called a plough pan, which is where farm machinery has gone over at the same depth for years and years and years, and it's slowly compacted a layer of soil that tree roots find it really difficult to penetrate through. So what would happen to those trees if we didn't subsoil on those sites is that after about the age of 15, they would all fall over because their roots would be incredibly shallow. So we also have to look for things like, is the weather suitable? You know, we don't want it to be incredibly frosty. A few years back, I was out doing the tree planting myself, and we had the beast from the east, and obviously couldn't plant the trees when the ground is frozen. Not only is that hard work for the tree planter, but the tree is likely to become also frozen and not make it through the winter. We also had to, on this site, ensure that seed sowing had been completed. So we'd discussed with the landowners that we were going to establish a 1 hectare field of native wildflower meadow. And the idea is that you plant the trees into the wildflower meadow, and then you get this lovely ephemeral habitat with a wildflower meadow for the first few years. And then when the trees establish and close their canopies, the wildflower meadow, or some of it, is lost, but you get that nice benefit of having wildflowers there. In this case, what we did is part of the wildflower meadow forms a large part of the open space, so that wildflower meadow will remain there, and they will maintain it as part of the woodland management programme, so there will always be a wildflower meadow on site. So here are some lovely pictures of the trees being planted. So 5,500 whips were planted by about 4 men over 6 days. It was quite an interesting job for them, because we didn't use any tree guards whatsoever. So it's not that we were just plastic free, we didn't use any tree guards. We didn't even use bamboo canes to mark out the trees, which is something that can be quite helpful when you're trying to find them in the summer. We used a slip planting method, which causes minimal disturbance to the soil, and is really quick and easy. You can see there that we planted with what we call cell-grown stock. So this means that instead of them having bare roots, which is typical, they have a small plug of soil. We got these from a British nursery that grows British sourced seeds in peat-free soil medium. So it is hopefully as environmentally and ecologically friendly as possible. The young trees range from 10 centimetres to 60 centimetres. Normally I wouldn't go to plant something that was 10 centimetres, but anybody who's involved in tree planting will know that getting hold of stock at the moment is really difficult, because everybody is trying to plant trees. Organisations like the Forestry Commission, the Community Forest, Woodland Trust, National Trust, the Wildlife Trust, and private landowners. So there's been a real rush on the tree nurseries, and unfortunately nobody thought to tell them a few years ago that they might need to grow on a few more stock than they were expecting. So there are some trees that are in short supply, but we all seem to be managing. And each tree was mulched with high-grade wood mulch. So it's important to keep a weed-free, grass-free area immediately around the base of the tree. Obviously, trees have evolved alongside other plants, but in order to give them the best head start possible and to start storing and sequestering carbon as quickly as possible, we want them to get away quickly. So an ecologically friendly way to do this without using herbicide is to suppress the grasses and competitive vegetation around the base of the tree using a mulch mat, which is a thin organic fibre mat that you peg down, or by using wood mulch. And we did a depth of about 10 centimetres. I went back last week. It seems to have done the job, so I'm really pleased with that. So here's another nice picture of all those trees in bags ready to be planted. You can see that they're being really gently handled. Trees don't like being moved. You might have noticed that trees that are planted in association with new car parks or along roadsides that are either of a half standard or standard size, so things that are kind of 4, 6, 8 foot tall, tend to die. Unfortunately, without a lot of care and careful handling, larger trees have a higher mortality rate than smaller trees, which is why we plant with smaller trees. Not only is it more cost effective, but the trees have a much better survival rate. I would expect minimum 75% of these trees to survive, if not more, like 90%. So you can see, you might be able to pick out some of the species that they're planting there. So we planted largely English oak, but we also put in some sessile oak to reflect the woodland that was adjacent. We've got some small leaf lime, we've got hazel, there was a few sweet chestnut in there, a lovely tree and requested by the landowner. A lot of silver birch went in, things like dogwood, hawthorn, and some rose species as well for the shrub layer. So the planting was also randomised, and typically trees are planted in lines or rows, which makes it really easy to manage them and weed them, and also find ones that need replacing. But the randomised reflects the kind of like natural look of a woodland, and this is something that the landowners really wanted. So this is the Wildflower Meadow before and after. So we did 1 hectare of Wildflower Meadow. You might be able to make out, or you probably can't, it's probably too small. The bales were just left around the side, no, not wrapped at all, so no other materials involved, and they've been left to compost around the side. And a native restore and enrich wildflower mix was used. So you can see here, this is year 1, so only the annuals have come through. But we've got some lovely chamomile, some cornflower, and some meadow cockles there, corn cockles, sorry. And there's also poppy in there. There's a lot of, I think it was 9% yellow rattle, which parasitises grasses. So it's only going to get better with age. So here are the outcomes. 7 hectares of woodland planted. 2 existing woodlands have been connected. 1 pond suitable for great crested newt is going to be installed over this summer, which will be directly between the 2 existing ponds. Over a 100-year lifespan of that woodland, there will be 2,500 tonnes of carbon sequestered, and we've also managed to create, even if some of it's only temporary, 1 hectare of native wildflower meadow. And that is just one of over 100 projects that we have delivered in the last 2 winters. I think it's actually more like 140 projects. We've delivered 150 hectares of woodland so far just on this project, not including Northern Forest or other projects that we're delivering. And our target is to hit 900 hectares by 2025. And it looks like we might achieve that. But any help is always very appreciated. So one of these sites with these standard trees here is actually an urban green up site, so not the project that I work on, but one that my colleague works on, and looks fantastic. This is the site at Picton, where you can see Rock Ferry in the distance there, and some of my colleagues planting trees. So things are looking really positive, but it is quite a challenge ahead of us. So just a refresher, some of the outcomes that come from tree planting. There's huge benefits to be had to well-being and community engagement. And the more we can involve local communities and local people in any way they want to be involved, whether that's coming and helping us do baseline surveys, recording data as we go along, coming and getting involved in planting trees. We really love working with communities. And so this is just what you could do. Get in touch with us if there's something you feel like you could help us with. If it's recording, that's fantastic. If you think you know somewhere that could benefit from trees, that's brilliant as well. So please get in touch. We don't bite. We really want to hear from you. And yeah, thanks for listening to my talk.